as this is the first talk of our entire conference, we wanted to start at the beginning and introduce the person who kind of brought us all here in the first place, which is the founder of DNA. Alexia Tanis founded DNA last year as a member, a third-year student at Royal Holloway, and she's joining us from sunny Sicily. So have at it, Alexia.
Hi, thank you very much, Dexter. So I'll get started right away with my speech. Almost 3 years ago, in April 2018, I was scared of the woman I had become. I was disappointed because once again I hit rock bottom. I will not say that this was the worst one, and for those of you here that have been in that sterile place and survived it, you may know that the last one feels different. It's not the worst, it's just one too many. So this time I embraced it, and in my tears I said to myself, may this day be blessed as the beginning of my rebirth. So I lived and I learned, and here I am, not better nor stronger, but proud of the woman I became. I recovered, but many others didn't. And I felt that this victory could never be mine, and mine only. It needed to be ours. So I started thinking of ways to help. I knew from the start that we as a community could not continue treating the struggle of dependency and addiction like we had done before. That we needed to start campaigning for tomorrow to be a better day for all those that struggle with drug and alcohol misuse. So on that same night, I wrote my campaign proposal for DNA. I knew this could never be a one-woman show, but I was so scared it might have to be. But my friends stood by my side. They held my hand and told me to keep on going. I was hesitant, but I started recruiting to build a team, hoping I would find people that would feel as passionate as I am. Now, recruiting is a nice word, but it felt more like playing a game of Marco Polo in the dark and underwater. So I shouted, "Does anybody care?" and waited until all I heard was "I do" everywhere around me. However, I was wrong. I did not find people that were as passionate as me. They were more motivated, more dedicated, and more passionate than I could have ever imagined. My body shook so much during our first meeting. I could not believe anybody would show up. When we started, we expected nothing. We celebrated every little step. When people gave 5 minutes of their time, maybe 10. But as week passed, team members started giving an hour of their time. Then it became 2. And by February, we were a team of 10 and we were working 3 hours in a row every Thursday. Now, to put this in context for you, when we accumulate every hour of work from every individual team member, we reached over 500 hours of work in 4 months. This is 500 hours we did not spend watching movies, 500 hours we did not spend partying or sleeping, and this is surely not 500 hours that we spent studying for our degrees. No, this is the time we dedicated to this campaign, time we traded away in the hope of creating a safer future, so that others would never feel the pain that we were so lucky to survive. When some of us joined the campaign, that pain was still waiting on their shoulders. But today, I am so proud and honored to say that they fought their demons, and with every step they got better, and with kindness they healed themselves and stopped misusing drugs and alcohol. And I'll have a drink to that. If any of you still doesn't believe in harm reduction policies, then you must believe in the kindness, the care, and the empathy that motivates us. It is that same kindness that brings me to say that nobody needs to be innocent or on the verge of death to be helped, that everyone deserves to be treated with respect and decency, that we cannot criminalize vulnerability, we cannot punish lack of luck or lack of information. In a society that is anything but perfect, we cannot blame those who seek an escape. We can only offer the resources they need to fight their addiction, the education they deserve to make their decisions, and the support we ought to provide to be able to call ourselves a civilized society. So this is what harm reduction is for us. Us who have been failed by punitive action. Harm reduction is the kindness to help without judgment. Harm reduction is prioritizing safety and well-being because we understand that people will always want to discover and experiment with legal or illegal substances. Our role isn't to control and prohibit the choices of others. The taboo and misinformation that has surrounded alcohol and drugs have created a halo of mystery and misinformation around safer consumption and the road to sobriety. So this is the story I want to tell my children, that while the world was busy judging the wounded, we helped and they healed. Now, this is the first speech I wrote for the campaign. It talks of the passion of the beginnings and the victories of our first year of campaigning. This year, I am honored and proud to open our second annual Awareness Week. It is a pleasure to welcome back some of last year's speakers, but also to see the new ones who have joined us. Or maybe should I say that we have joined them in a revolution they started much before we did. I come to you all as the founder of the project, but it is with the eyes of a spectator that I see this year's team and their president rise to face new challenges and make the campaign better than I could have ever imagined. Their dedication to this project is what keeps me hoping for a better future. So thank you all who have decided to join us this week for this incredible selection of talks. And thank you all who have made it possible.
Awesome. Thank you, Alexia. That was amazing. And a lot of that energy that you just heard her say is exactly what we have brought into organizing this talk and this entire conference. So now I'll introduce who's going to actually be introducing our first speaker. Her name's Georgie. She's actually a second year Royal Holloway student in psychology, and she's passionate about sex and relationships education. Georgie created Royal Holloway's Sex and Relationships Instagram page and group to provide a non-judgmental, informative space for students where they can find pleasure-centered information and also ask anonymous questions and get them answered. She also recently gave a TED Talk with TEDx Royal Holloway on sexual shame and is on the youth board for an arts charity called Tender, who work with young people to prevent domestic abuse and sexual violence through creative projects. Just before we hand it over to you, a quick content warning note for everyone out there. Given the nature of the topic, this talk will include sexually explicit content, swearing, and references to sexual assault. So over to you, Georgie.
So SRE and DNA are excited to introduce returning speaker, Alex Aldrige. After completing her master's degree at the University of Cambridge, Alex is now a PhD candidate from Royal Holloway's Law and Criminology Department. In her talk, she will dig into some of the issues around intoxication and sexual consent, more specifically in relation to the notion of capacity. Drawing on a case study from her PhD research projects, she demonstrates the need for sensitivity to the complexities of people's sex on drug experiences and critiques the conventional view that intoxication equals impairment. Given the nature of the topic, the talk will include sexually explicit content, swearing, and reference to sexual assault.
Hello, thanks for introducing me, Georgie, and it was so cool to hear about your work as well. It sounds great. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Does that work okay?
It looks a little bit zoomed in, actually.
It looks zoomed in. How about, is that good?
Yes. Perfect.
Okay, cool. And can you just see the slide? You can't see like anything
just
else? Okay, great. I had a bit of a mishap with this in another time, so that's really good news. Okay, great. Yeah. So yeah, thank you so much for having me and for inviting me back again. My name is Alex, and like it was already said, I'm a third year PhD student at Royal Holloway. And today I'm going to be talking to you about some of my PhD findings. And the topic is sex, drugs, capacity, and incapacity. It's the third content warning we're giving you now. So this is a content warning. There's going to be sexually explicit content, some swearing, and there'll also be some discussion of sexual assault as well. And actually, I'm going to be diving straight in with reference to sexual assault. So just giving you a heads up for that. So I'd like you to have a look at this photograph. So this is a photo of a teenage girl who, with a group of other teenagers, she was at a house party, she got really drunk, and she ended up being sexually assaulted by two boys. So some of you might well already be familiar with this case. It happened in a town called Steubenville in the US in 2012, and it got quite a lot of coverage. Even a documentary was made about it, and this was mostly because the two boys were on their school's football team. And there were some accusations that the football coach tried to help protect them and tried to cover everything up, basically. And even if you're not familiar with this particular case, I'm sure you're familiar with cases like it. You know, we've got a girl who's like either drunk or high to the point of unconsciousness or semi-consciousness, maybe. And then we've got a guy or multiple guys who take advantage of her being in that state. So I'd also like to share with you some of the words of one of this girl's classmates, and they were either witnesses to what happened or they saw photographs like this one that were being circulated. So I'm not sure if they're actually there or not, but this is what they said. So that girl, what did they do to that girl? Laughter. She is so raped right now. A dead body. So that's what her classmates were saying about her. So what we've got here then is this like description of a body that is so passive and so lifeless that we can even call it a dead body. So her body, because of drugs, in this case alcohol, no longer has any capacity for action. Instead, things are happening to it. And this is probably a really familiar idea to lots of us, particularly those of us who have grown up as women. It's almost a kind of warning of what can happen to us if we're not careful. Oh yeah, I should have clicked that before, but that's okay, a summary of what I said. Yeah, so once we get to a certain age as women, we start going out, we start drinking, we start taking drugs. There's always this kind of underlying message that we're not safe. You know, we're told that there are these men out there who are just like really waiting for us to get into a vulnerable state where they can then take advantage of us. And maybe they're even going to contribute to us getting to this vulnerable state by spiking our drinks while our backs are turned. So to avoid this happening to us, we need to be careful. We need to be sensible and responsible. We need to watch our drink, like this poster says. We're also told to stay in groups, you know, don't get separated, don't leave your friends alone. And we're also told to avoid getting overly intoxicated, because when we drink or take drugs, we're putting ourselves at risk. So basically for women, an intoxicated state is a vulnerable one. The more intoxicated we are, whether it's from alcohol or other drugs, the more vulnerable we are to sexual assault. Now, obviously, these kinds of messages have been challenged by feminists who very rightly say that, you know, this is victim blaming, and instead of teaching women to keep themselves safe, we need instead to teach men not to rape people. And obviously, I think this is important, and we should never blame people for the terrible things that happen to them. But that's not what I'm going to be focusing on in this presentation. What I want to do instead is to really dig into the roles that drugs play in these situations. So to return to this image of the young girl, she's very clearly either drunk to the point of semi-consciousness or unconsciousness. Like her head is hanging really limply back. She's basically being dragged around by these two boys. So in legal terms, we would describe her as being incapacitated. So what I want to do now is dig into incapacity a little bit where it relates to the use of drugs, because there are other ways that people can be incapacitated that don't involve drugs. But for the purposes of this presentation, we're just going to think about incapacity that involves drugs. So what is incapacitation and how is it connected to intoxication? So because drug use is really prevalent in student populations, you'll often find that universities will give their students information about this type of thing. So maybe, for example, in Freshers Week, you'll be given some kind of leaflet about sex and there's a section on drugs, or maybe you go to some kind of like sexual consent workshop, where again, they'll maybe mention drugs at least a little bit. I know I've got a picture of Royal Holloway on here because I thought it was topical, but I'm going to show you an example of some advice given by a different university. It's an American university because they actually tend to do it a little bit more. And the example I'm going to give you is from Dartmouth Uni. So Dartmouth says, consent, and here obviously they mean sexual consent, cannot be given by a person who is incapacitated. Therefore, it is imperative to be able to determine the difference between incapacitation and intoxication. Incapacitation is a state beyond drunkenness or intoxication. So what Dartmouth clearly is illustrating here is that intoxication and incapacitation are two separate states. And while an intoxicated person might well be able to consent to sex, an incapacitated person definitely can't. So we need to be able to identify when a person is incapacitated, because if someone is in that state, then we should not be having sex with them. So how can we tell then if someone is incapacitated? Luckily, again, Dartmouth has some advice on this. They say, an individual who is incapacitated lacks the ability to make informed judgments and cannot consent to sexual contact. Incapacitation is the inability, temporarily or permanently, to give consent, because an individual is mentally and or physically helpless, asleep, unconscious, or unaware that sexual activity is occurring. So we've got these quite clear, concrete things to look out for. We've got asleep, we've got unconscious, but then we've also got these more vague, potentially subjective things like mentally and or physically helpless or unaware that sexual activity is occurring. And I say that these are more subjective just because people are likely to have different standards on this and that they'd be likely to judge it differently. And we can actually really clearly see that play out with the Steubenville case, where defendants of the accused boys were saying things like, oh, well, you know, the girl, she was able to like unlock her phone at some point in the evening. So, you know, someone who can unlock their phone is clearly not incapacitated. Here's the actual quote of what was said, just to give you a bit more of an idea. So, a defense attorney for Malik, who was one of the accused boys, told a reporter that the alleged victim was conscious enough to provide the passcodes for her cell phone at some point after the second alleged assault. That doesn't sound like a person that's incapacitated to the point where they cannot answer a question, let alone consent, the defense attorney said. So I guess my point here is that even when we've got this visual evidence of a young girl being in an incapacitated state, it's obviously just not enough for some people. You know, they're still trying to say she consented, she wasn't incapacitated. And I think, you know, again, we're going back to the idea of victim blaming, where people will say things like, you know, oh, you chose to get drunk, you chose to get yourself into this state. So basically, you know, because of that, you're responsible for whatever happens to you. And here is a poster where we can see that exact narrative really clearly. The text is a bit small, so I'm just going to read it out to you. So it says, she didn't want to do it, but she couldn't say no. When your friends drink, they can end up making bad decisions, like going home with someone they don't know very well. Decisions like this leave them vulnerable to dangers like date rape. Help your friends stay in control and stay safe. Obviously, this is written in gender neutral language, but we can see from the picture that they've chosen that the implication is that when women drink, they're putting themselves at risk. So again, intoxication equals vulnerability. When women drink, the poster says, they're no longer in control. Their capacity to, you know, do the things they want and act the way they want is reduced or maybe even taken away entirely. So what I want to do in this presentation then is dig into this idea much more. And what I want to do most of all is to question the amount of agency or power that we're giving to drugs in these situations. Because we keep encountering this idea that drugs are the problem, you know, drugs are what's making these women vulnerable. Drugs are what's removing their ability to do or say what they want to do in sexual situations. Again, going back to Dartmouth Uni really quickly, we can see this idea set out quite clearly here. They're basically warning students about the dangers of drugs and saying, you know, they impair our judgment, they affect our capacity to communicate, they impact our ability to read and interpret others' communication. So again, drugs are being given a lot of power here. Drugs are what the problem is. But what I want to argue is that it's just much more complicated than just saying, it's drugs. There's all sorts of reasons why a person might be vulnerable, and there's all sorts of reasons why they might not be able to say or do what they want when they're having sex. So what we're going to do now is hear from a woman who was a participant in my PhD research, and we're going to hear about one of her experiences of sex that involved drug use. I'll be telling her story in her own words, and I'm just going to leave it up to you to kind of form your own opinion about what happened. So the woman we're going to hear from is a participant called Ellie, which is obviously not her real name. She is 27, bisexual, a cis woman, and uses she, her pronouns. So in my project, there are two ways that I've collected data. The first is from like participant diaries, where I ask them to write about their sex on drug experiences. And then when they return their diaries, I also interview them. But the story I'm going to share with you here, it comes from Ellie's diary. So this is what she wrote. And also now there's going to be sexually explicit content and swearing. So this is what she wrote. It was the Monday after a big party and I was on a come down from MDMA. I'd had a busy day at work and I was exhausted. I'd had plans to see Elle after work, which I no longer wanted to do. However, I needed to stay over at his place because I had a work meeting the next day in part of city where he lived. God, I read that back. I had a work meeting the next day in a part of city. in a part of a city. Yeah, in a part of a city, and he lived nearby. I took a diazepam and smoked some hash outside his house while waiting for him to get back from work. The diazepam was for my come down. The hash I would smoke most evenings anyway, though it also helped with the come down. I spotted Al from a distance turning onto his road, and I remember thinking that although he dressed well, it didn't quite suit him. In anticipation of me coming, Al had booked us a restaurant and booked us tickets for a gig. We arrived at the vegetarian, very thoughtful of him, restaurant, and at first, being stoned made things easier. It helped with my horrible come down, as did the diazepam, and I felt more engaged with our conversation. I always feel like a better conversationalist while stoned. It also made the food extremely enjoyable. As we were finishing our food, my exhaustion hit me harder, and I just wanted to go to bed. But we still had a gig to go to, and I knew he'd want to have sex. I could tell already, though, that sex was the last thing I wanted to do. I remember feeling anxious about how I would say no when he inevitably tried it on. He'd clearly made an effort with the restaurant and the gig, and I didn't want to come off as ungrateful. I went to the bathroom just before we left for the gig. While sat on the toilet, I gave myself a pep talk. Something like, you don't owe anyone sex. It's fine to say no. You can say no. I knew, though, that when it came down to actually saying no, it wouldn't be so simple. We then went to the gig, which was in the basement of a pub. He put his arm around my shoulders. He was shorter than me, which meant I had to bend my body at an awkward angle. It hurt, but the music was too loud for me to ask him to stop. I felt too bad to ask him to stop anyway. We got home, smoked some hash, and sat on his bed. Usually, being stoned helps me to get in the mood for sex, but this time it didn't change anything. I remember his sheets were dirty and smelly. He kissed me, and I hated it. His mouth was cold and tasted of tobacco. He kept forcing his tongue into my mouth, even though mine was closed. I repeatedly ended the kiss and turned my head away, but he was very persistent. We got properly into bed, and he kissed me more. I said that I was tired, over and over again, but I couldn't say what I really wanted to say, which was I don't want to have sex. Eventually, for some reason, he stopped. We watched an episode of a TV show on his laptop, and we fell asleep. Then it was the morning. We were spooning. He was the big spoon. I felt bad in my body. I was bloated from the meal the night before, and I hadn't showered in more than 24 hours, very unusual for me. I had also, apologies for the language, been doing massive come-down related shits the day before. This only intensified my desire to shower. I also had what I call a cystitis-y feeling because I hadn't been drinking enough water. I always had my bottle with me, but I hadn't been able to refill the night before. I felt him move behind me, and I knew he must be awake. And I could tell straight away he was going to try again. Without any warning, his hands were in my pants. It was fucking gross. He began to finger me, and there was no pleasure. It just hurt. I kept facing away from him, barely moving, and hoping that my lack of kissing and or interest in general would make it clear I wasn't down, but it didn't work. He asked me if what he was doing felt good, and I said yes, because how could I say no? I wanted it to end, so I said, let's have sex. Sex felt preferable to the fingering, as it wasn't something done only for my pleasure, if that makes sense. He put a condom on and fucked me for what felt like forever. It hurt. I was on my hands and knees, doggy style, which I hate, but he still didn't come. I made noises hoping it would help him finish, but it didn't. Then he asked me if he could come on my back. I said, sure, yes, anything, fine. So he wanked over me until he came. And then he asked me if I wanted him to finish me off, which pissed me off. There was no way that this man had the ability to make me come. I said no, and then I showered, which felt extremely good. I ended up skipping my work meeting and got the train home. Later that day, I realized I was sick with a bad cold or flu type thing. I felt almost like it was his fault. Okay, so what I want to do is to break down Ellie's story a little bit for you. So let's go back to the beginning first. Okay, so a number of things I want to draw your attention to here. First is this really clear impact that MDMA is having on the way Ellie is feeling, even 2 full days now after she's taken it. So we usually only think about what drugs a person is on, you know, in that moment in time, but MDMA was clearly still very relevant to how Ellie was feeling. Even if she wasn't feeling, you know, the acute effects of it at that moment in time, she was still really exhausted from it. And this ultimately affected her experiences of these 2 other drugs she took, which the first was diazepam, which is a type of benzodiazepine similar to Valium, and hash, which I'm sure you all know is a type of cannabis. So in order for us to understand how the hash and the diazepam are making Ellie feel, we need to think about it in relation to her MDMA come down. The other important thing she mentions is her need to stay over at this guy's place. You know, so she's got something that she needs from him, which maybe on the surface doesn't seem like such a big deal. But if things were different, and if she didn't have to go to that meeting in the morning, she might well have cancelled their plans altogether. She then describes the 2 of them arriving at this really nice restaurant. And we can see this like transformative quality to her, kind of the way she experiences cannabis, where she becomes what she describes as a better conversationalist while she's stoned. And firstly, what this does, I think, is it really disrupts that idea I spoke about before, where drugs are seen to be making, you know, communication more difficult. They're seen to impair your communication. For Ellie, it actually seems to, you know, be enhancing her capacity for communication. But when I say this, I want to be a bit careful, because I don't want to say, you know, she took cannabis and her communication was enhanced. Like, she's also in a nice restaurant, she's sitting down, she's eating food. Like, for someone who's knackered and on a come down, like, all of those things are going to be contributing to this like sense of enhancement, like, all at the same time. And just to kind of confirm that point, as soon as they finish eating, Ellie's exhaustion just hits her really hard again. So what this shows is that feeling good while you're on drugs, you know, like, it's relational and it's fragile and it's dependent on things coming together in a certain way and at a certain time, and it can change very quickly. Because it does change really quickly, we get this sense of anxiety emerging. So Ellie's anxious about whether she's going to be able to say no to sex that she doesn't want to have, which I think is worth unpacking a little bit further. Because I think what we're seeing really is the presence of, you know, common narratives around like heterosexual dating, where it's very much expected that men are going to pursue sex and then women are going to have to be the ones who say yes or no to it. And this is all bound up for Ellie with this sense of obligation, because he's picked this nice restaurant, he's found this gig for them to go to, he's just made an effort. And even though we see her, you know, kind of battling almost with those expectations, where she sits on the toilet and gives herself a pep talk, like, you know, no, you don't have to have sex with him, blah, blah, blah. Like, she knows that when it actually comes down to it, it's going to be much more complicated, even if, you know, the pep talk makes it seem simple. Then we go to the gig and we can see that the night is just really deteriorating for her. Like, she just seems really fed up. And I think what she says here is also quite foreshadowing of what happens later. So, you know, the guy's got his arm around her shoulders, and because of their height difference, it means her body's like being pulled down really awkwardly. And she can't even tell him that he's hurting her. Like, she feels too bad to tell him. So going back to what I talked about at the beginning of the presentation about, you know, drugs being what's removing women's capacity to do or say what they want. Like, we do get this sense here that Ellie's capacity to say what she wants is reduced. She can't tell him, but we can't really explain this in a satisfying way by saying, you know, oh, she was on drugs. Like, it's because of drugs she couldn't say what she wanted. Like, obviously drugs are there, you know, she has taken them, and they are playing some kind of role in the situation, but so is, you know, her sense of guilt, and even like the music as well. Like, it's too loud for her to speak. So when we're thinking about someone not being able to do what they want to do, I would argue that yes, we should consider the drugs, but we also have to consider everything else that's going on and how it's all like interacting together. So we move on. Now the two of them are back at his place. They're smoking hash together. They're sat on his bed. And the first thing I want to point out here is that Ellie says, you know, usually she associates being stoned with an enhanced desire for sex. But this time, it doesn't help her at all. And again, that just shows how the effects of drugs are only ever relational and are dependent on everything else that's going on. And she describes his dirty sheets, you know, and they smell as well. She can taste tobacco when they kiss, like his mouth is cold. Like, all of her senses are just, you know, being bombarded in this really unpleasant way. And it sounds almost overwhelming. And she also describes all of these indicators that she's giving, which she sees as evidence that she doesn't want to have sex. So, for example, you know, she says she keeps her mouth closed when they kiss. She turns her head away. She says that she's tired. And who's to say what actually makes him give up in the end? Because Ellie herself isn't really sure. But, you know, eventually, for some reason, he does stop and they watch TV and fall asleep. But what strikes me most about this part of Ellie's story is where she writes that I couldn't say what I really wanted to say, which was, I don't want to have sex. So there's this real disconnect between what's going on like inside her body and what she's communicating with her body. And obviously we can put some blame on the guy for not picking up these, you know, less explicit signals. But Ellie also, she does recognize that it would have been better for her to say, you know, more clearly, I don't want to have sex. Like, that might have been better. And I think that's because we're taught, like, especially as women, that we need to be really very clear about what we want and what we don't want. You know, you want to have sex, then say yes very clearly, very explicitly, enthusiastically. If you don't want to have sex, then say no. Make it very clear what you want and what you don't want. But men, on the other hand, we just kind of presume that they want to have sex like all of the time. And like Ellie herself did this. Like, Ellie presumed right from the beginning that this guy would want to have sex with her. I mean, she was right, but she did presume it. And of course, this is problematic too, because, you know, what if men don't want to have sex? Do their desires and does their consent not matter? So back to the story again. Ellie says she can't say what she really wants to say. And we could think about this in relation to the fact that she's on drugs. You know, her communication is impaired, like maybe Dartmouth University would say. But again, that just really doesn't satisfy me as an explanation, because it's not that she can't speak. Like, she does say other things. She says that she's tired. So I think rather than impaired, I would say, and this is a term I'm borrowing from another drugs researcher called Faye Dennis, that Ellie is blocked. Her capacity to affect the situation in the way that she wants is blocked. And we can only understand this blockage in relation to all those other things that are going on that I've mentioned already, you know, those heterosexual dating norms, her exhaustion, her come down, the fact that she needs something from this guy, the fact that the guy doesn't pick up on her cues, you know, the list could go on and on and on. So moving on to what is probably the worst part of the story. It's morning. She wakes up, she feels terrible. Like, I'm sure we can all relate. Sometimes you just wake up feeling bad. You just feel like off. And And she describes some of the things that are contributing to this, you know, like dehydration. She feels like maybe she's getting a urinary tract infection, a UTI. She also very candidly says that she's doing massive shits all day the day before, which, you know, I'm sure anyone who's taken MDMA or stimulants can relate to. That obviously does happen. And then in the second paragraph, something I think is really interesting is when she says, I could tell straight away that he was going to try again. And it's interesting because they're spooning. She can't like see his face. Like she just senses or feels that he's going to try. And I'm having trouble like putting what this sense is into words. But, you know, maybe it's something we can all relate to again, because, you know, sometimes you just feel in the atmosphere what someone else is thinking or feeling. Like maybe that's what we call a vibe. You can tell like what's going to happen, which is obviously an important part of sex, isn't it? Like a lot of it is unspoken. We often rely on these like atmospheres or vibes to let us know like what's going on and how our partner is feeling, or partners. And while sometimes that can result in like really good sex, we can see with Ellie that sometimes it can be really bad as well. Right. Okay. And the last thing from this section, he starts to finger her. It's horrible. It hurts. And then we've got this really important moment where the guy asks Ellie, you know, does this feel good? Is this good for you? And she says yes, because she says, how could I say no? So on one level, we could consider this to be a kind of irrational move on Ellie's part. You know, he's given her this very clear opportunity to say, you know, no, it doesn't feel good. Can you stop? And maybe we can, you know, also give him some credit. You know, maybe he did pick up on some of her, you know, bodily cues. Maybe he could tell she wasn't really into it, so he wanted to check. But then she says, no, it is good. So, you know, how should he know that it isn't good? Like, are we expecting too much of him to be able to know that? Like, did he do enough, or like, should he have done more? But I think what I want to do is move away from the idea of saying what each of them should have done in the situation. Like, sure, it would have been better if Ellie had said something different. And equally, you know, it could have been better if Elle had asked her a different question, or just, you know, realized that she was uncomfortable despite what she'd said. But, you know, the reality is that they're just two people navigating a really complex situation in the way that all sexual situations are complex. This is probably quite a clear example of what we'd call a grey area. You know, I've told this story to a bunch of people, and some of them are, you know, convinced that it's sexual assault. Some of them think it's totally fine, and some of them are just, you know, a bit confused. Like me, I myself am confused by this story. You know, how I feel about it really changes depending on when I'm reading it. You know, maybe one day I think something, another day I think something else. So the way that this story affects people, it's not fixed, and it changes depending on where it's being told and who it's being told to. Something that might be interesting to do is, you know, to reflect yourself on your own life experiences, your own sexual experiences, and consider how they might be affecting how you're understanding this story now when I read it to you. You know, does that change the way you're feeling about it? Can you like relate to her? Can you relate to him, or completely not at all? So now, just onto the final part of the story. Ellie feels the quickest and easiest way to end the experience is to instigate penetrative sex. So, you know, on one level, this might come across as her, you know, taking control of the situation by like changing what's happening in a way that's a bit more suited to her desires, which is for the sex to end quickly. But then on another level, you can kind of see that this is the best she feels she can do in the circumstances. So I want to pose the question now, like, do you think that this sexual experience was consensual for Ellie? Me and her did talk about this in her interview, and she said that yes, she thought it had been. She said she did two things that felt like consent. The first one was saying, let's have sex. And the second one was when he asked if he could come on her back, and she said yes. But having said that, she did also feel that he hadn't been very good at picking up on her body language, and she felt he could have kind of done a bit better at that. So she was ambivalent, but I think for the most part thought it was probably consensual. So I guess what we need to take from this is that, consent isn't the be all and end all in making sex good for people. Like, yes, of course, consent is important, but we can see from Ellie's experience that you can have sex that is both consensual and horrible. And this experience, it did affect Ellie for a long time after. She told me she just felt really gross about it, and she felt upset with herself that she hadn't been able to say what she wanted. That was upsetting to her. So I just want to conclude by bringing things back to drugs. So what I've tried to do in my analysis of Ellie's story is to really decenter the role that drugs play in either reducing or eliminating women's capacities to do or say what they want during sex. Because Ellie did find it difficult to say what she wanted, and she was on drugs, but drugs were just one part of a very complex situation where there were loads and loads and loads of different things that were affecting what was happening. So the reason I want to do this like decentering thing so much is mostly because when we do focus really heavily on drugs, it's usually kind of bad. So just to give you an example, you might have heard in the news recently that there's been a real push to reclassify the drug GHB. So we've got some recent headlines here from the past few months. The first one, date rape drug GHB should be reclassified as Class B, official report finds. Killer drug GHB should be reclassified. The killer chemsex drug GHB should be reclassified as Class B drug, blah, 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 blah. So you'd think reading these headlines that GHB itself is out there raping and killing people. And of course, it's just not. People are doing that. And they did it before GHB, and they'll do it after. But by putting all of our energy into, reclassifying this drug, which history tells us isn't going to do anything to stop people accessing and using it, it just seems like a waste of time. Wouldn't it be better for us to, think more about education and harm reduction and other kind of, just more fruitful things that might help make sex better for people? I'm also aware that I've not really come up with a good idea of what we can do instead, but I'm hoping that I'll come up with a good idea at some point. So yes, that's all I've got to say for today. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you again to the organisers so much for having me. This is my email address, my Twitter and my TikTok account. So if you want to get in touch with me about anything, please do.
Ooh. Can we have a round of applause for Alex? Maybe you can unmute and clap your hands. That was great. Thank you so much. Cool. So hi everybody, I'm the project doctor at DNA. I've been moderating, I've been letting all the people in. So we're gonna ask some questions to Alex now. So if you want to ask any questions, just put them in the chat. I don't think we need to do all caps because the chat's not exactly popping off. Anyway, so we'll start with this one, if you're ready, Alex. Can you expand on Faye Dennis's understanding of blockage, please? Do you have any advice for how to overcome this?
Yes, I hope I can do it justice because like everything she writes, I really love her work. It's really, really amazing and complex. So I'll give it a go. But I'm sorry if it's not really clear. But yeah, basically, she talks about drug using bodies as kind of becoming different things. So she talks about, and becoming with a hyphen. So she'd be like becoming normal or becoming other or becoming blocked was one of them. So like, I think her use of like that hyphen is kind of important because it shows how like interlinked and relational everything is. So, when I was talking about how, we need to understand things in relation to each other all the time, that's also like really inspired by her work and kind of a bunch of other people as well who do similar things. And when she talks about becoming blocked, it's to kind of say, the way that all these different bodies come together, and that can be human bodies, it could be, you know, drugs as a body, it could be like discourses as a body, you know, they all kind of work together, they're all on the same level, and they all like stop people from being able to, like, you know, become in the way that we want. So it's this idea of becoming, you know, like seeing things as like constantly in flux and change. So let me just give an example, because it's always better when I don't speak so abstractly. I'm not very good at that. She talks about in her book about like injecting drug users. She talks about one man's body becoming blocked from being like a legitimate partner choice. So he's hanging out with his girlfriend, and I think her family like really rejects him because he's an injecting drug user, and they think, you know, he'll be a bad influence on their daughter or whatever. So she talks about how all these like discourses around injecting drug use, and more like material things as well, like his lack of wealth, like, you know, and the fact that he needs to spend all his time getting money and stuff like that, like block him from, like make him become blocked from being like an appropriate partner, and then he's treated badly as a result of it. So I hope that's some kind of explanation of it. But yeah, I'll put the name of her book in the chat because it's great. And Royal Holloway Library has the PDF of it available to download, because I asked for it and now they've got it, and it's great. So I'll write it in here. It's called Injecting Bodies in More Than Human Worlds. Oh, and then the second part of the question, do I have any advice for how to overcome this? Oh, like, I wish I did, because, like, you know, in the story I told, like, about, you know, Ellie just then, like, I can so see how she became blocked and couldn't do anything. I can really understand it, but it's hard to know, like, how do you overcome that? I mean, you know, because the only kind of advice I can think to give is, you know, start trying to think more clearly about what your boundaries are and how to assert them, and maybe practice saying no and see how it makes you feel when you say no, and this and that. And like, I think on one level that is really good advice, but then that kind of ignores the whole relationality aspect of it, because what I'm trying to do is stop putting the burden, you know, so to speak, on women to say what they want and don't want so much, because, you know, like, there's so many complex things going on that she did kind of say, but it was ignored. Like, so it's hard to say, you know, you need to do this and this better, like you need to change your behavior, because you want to say, well, actually we need to think about how we can create a world that's more that the people within it are more able to like do and say what they want. So it's a much more a big project than that. So yeah. I'm kind of working on it. I would say I'm working on trying to come up with some advice, but I don't have any like super clear advice that goes beyond the kind of advice that's already out there at the moment.
Well, I mean, from a personal kind of response to your kind of analysis of her story, it did make me think, you know, perhaps analyzing these experiences that happen to us and that we live may help us overcome them and avoid them in future, and get better at communicating with our bodies as well as our kind of verbal communication.
Do you know what? Yeah, that's a great point. Like, yeah. What a good idea. Yes, that's the advice.
Well, I mean, yeah, like, how do we stop this from happening in the future? Well, listen to this analysis.
Yeah, well, yeah, because something I've done like throughout the project is like keep a kind of sex on drug diary for myself, and I like write about every time I have sex on drugs, and in a similar way to my participant stories, I kind of look back to them and like cringe and just like, oh god. But you know, it's a useful exercise, and it can be quite fun putting a distance between you and yourself on paper as well, and kind of treating yourself as someone else and thinking how you would think of it from the outside. So yeah, what a great idea of yours. Like, writing and reflecting, and you know, when things have made you feel bad, kind of, I mean, you know, learning from them.
It's not my idea. There's many therapists like practice that. I think it's a very good, you know, I think there's like a self-authoring kind of style to it, and I think that's quite good. The second question is, what do we do to prevent and reduce future drug-related rape / bad sex? Linus, if you want to expand on your question, you can always turn on your camera and unmute and have a dialogue. Always welcome to do that.
I'm in the library. I can't, I'm afraid.
Okay. No, it's a great question. I think kind of like as these questions are so often answered, like it really comes down to like education, and both sex education and drug education, which like are lacking so much, like in schools and stuff. Like there's even at universities, like it's clear from like this group, like it's a new thing that's happening. It was lacking before. But like in primary schools and secondary schools, it's like even more lacking. So yeah, I think so. How to reduce future drug related rape, bad sex. I mean, they're kind of two separate but very related questions. Like how to reduce bad sex, I think like it has to be sex education that is pleasure focused and doesn't shy away from talking about those things, and isn't framed in terms of sex for reproduction and like how it biologically works and stuff. So I think that's kind of a kind of shift that should happen, and not sure why it hasn't. So that I feel like that would be good for reducing bad sex. Another thing that I think would help people reduce bad sex is reading this really great book that I read recently. I'll put the name in the chat. It's called Tomorrow Sex Will Be Good Again, and it's by a woman called Catherine Angel. And it's quite a short book actually, and it's not even very academic either. It's like it's great. But it's also a heads up, it's about like heterosexual sex between like cis men and women, so there might be a bit of a shortcoming, but I think that the stuff that comes out of it that can be applied more. But this book, what I love about it is it's it really goes against that idea that in order to have good sex you need to know what you want and say what you want in advance and be really like vocal and enthusiastic about it, because she says, how are we supposed to know what we want? Like you don't like sexual desire like emerges in context, it emerges like in relation to what's happening. You can't know that you have wanted to have this specific kind of sex act happen to you beforehand. I mean, maybe some people do, but like I think often it doesn't work like that. So she really rejects the idea that in order to have good sex we need to be very clear about what we want. And I think her kind of argument about reducing bad sex is to kind of embrace like vulnerability, because for vulnerability for women is seen to be something bad, avoid it. And she argues that vulnerability to men can so often be linked to like humiliation, which is then linked to anger. So there's all these kinds of things that she talks about that are really interesting, and I think would answer that question even better than I could. But yeah, I think again, reducing drug related rape has to be drug education, and people also like and like alcohol education as well, because I've got to say like the majority of the bad stories from like participants in my study were alcohol. Like 90% of them included alcohol rather than other drugs. I think there's something very like specific about alcohol being so like commonly used by people in their first sexual experiences, and sometimes they exclusively are having sex on alcohol. I think about the people like you encounter at university who maybe have never had sex not on alcohol. Yeah, so I think something to do with alcohol especially, but yeah.
So what started your kind of interest in this area of research? Maybe you can, I know you talked about it in the Instagram live that you did with us, but maybe you can talk about it here as well.
Yeah, no, I would love to. Yeah, so basically I started doing like a research assistant job in like 2016 that was about it was about chemsex and how like the Psychoactive Substances Act that was introduced in 2016 was going to affect men who have sex with men who are engaging in chemsex. So like chemsex is, I'm sure lots of you already know what chemsex is, but just in case, chemsex is like, I kind of think about it as like a specific like subsection of sex on drugs, because it refers to like a specific group of people using 3 specific drugs to have sex. So it's about like men who have sex with men, like I said, and the drugs are crystal meth, GHB or GBL, and methadone. And you saw like in the presentation at the end, like GHB was referred to in one of the headlines as killer chemsex drugs, because chemsex is always like very sensationalized and very, you know, like, ooh, sexy topic, chemsex, it's terrible, like men are dying and blah blah blah. Yeah, but so when I was working on that project, basically, there's already so much cool work about chemsex, like people problematizing chemsex definitions and saying, you know, we need to like not just focus on the negatives and the risks, but there's so much less research about sex on drugs where we're looking at like populations outside of men who have sex with men. So that's kind of what I wanted to do. I just kind of wanted to, after doing that project, do my own project that had a bigger focus, and particularly I'm particularly interested in the experiences of women, like obviously because I am one, but you know, like people of other genders as well, like try and be, you know, more inclusive in that thinking, and like try and hear from as many different people as possible. Yeah, so yeah, and then I got interested in consent like a little bit later, but it felt like it all kind of tied together nicely. So yeah, that's how it all started.
Cool. So the next question is, so somebody said, I really liked your point that gender expectations perhaps play more of a part, I guess they mean play more of a kind of big role in assault, or brackets, or just uncomfortable sexual encounters than the drugs itself. What are your thoughts on victim blaming in this aspect?
Yeah, and I think it really does. Like I think there's really something to be said there of just like, you know, like what seemed to be really underlying Ellie's story, I felt, was just like the desire not to be rude, like the desire to be polite, the desire to be like accommodating and nice to the guy. I think we talked about this a little bit more in her interview. She was just like, oh, you know, I feel bad, like I don't want him to feel like I don't fancy him and this and that. And it's like why? It's fine, like if you don't fancy him, but also I get it. So I think it's like a people pleasing thing, like the idea of people pleasing that, you know, we see of as like quite a gendered thing to do. Like women are like, you know, more feminine people are kind of thought to have to like, you know, manage people's emotions and like make sure people are feeling okay and do this kind of emotional work or emotional labor, maybe people call it, that like men aren't necessarily expected to do. And I think that just plays such a huge role in, I mean, and like I can see in the question the person's like not sure about whether to call it assault or an uncomfortable sexual encounter, and like I'm not sure either. Like I don't want to say like it plays a huge role in sexual assault, because obviously, you know, there are times when people are going to be like overpowered and forced, and then the politeness doesn't really seem like much of an issue in those cases. But then I guess it's the more kind of gray area ones that would fall into the middle and you'd be a bit less sure about. That's where I think that kind of politeness, like feeling you need to be polite, is really problematic. And I guess like victim blaming, so I guess if you're saying, so gender expectations play a role in assault, what does that mean for victim blaming? I mean, I kind of don't know what it means for victim blaming, because it almost seems like the blame falls then like outside of the people. But then, like I was kind of saying in the presentation, those gendered expectations, like they're like written onto our bodies, like they're part of our bodies, so they're not separate from us. But then the blame seems everywhere. So I don't know who you'd blame then if you're thinking that way, but maybe that's quite interesting, and maybe that's good. Like when you think, like, maybe blame isn't the right word, but like what you're seeing as being the issue here is everywhere. And I think that's a better way to think about it, because I feel like you're on the road to something a bit more productive and fruitful, even if I'm not sure what it is yet.
Yeah. A question that I asked you last year as well, because you had an interesting response, and I think it opened up a good discussion that kind of needed to also be had in the context of this one. From a personal experience, I've never really considered any of my sexual encounters to be consensual or non-consensual. At a time when I was experiencing problematic use, I never even thought about that, because I didn't think that, that my experience was of any kind of value, and it wasn't, I didn't need to think about it or talk about it to anyone. But then, after kind of getting over my struggles and moving past things, I began to realize that perhaps I had been in experiences that weren't consensual, which is an odd thing to discover. But I would never do anything about them, because I wouldn't want to get those people in trouble. And even if I could go back in time to the times when those experiences happened, I probably wouldn't have done anything about it, because when you get the police involved, then you also have to take into account the fact that the other person has drugs in their house, or that they're on drugs, or that they are, potentially selling drugs, or, all of these other things that kind of surround that. And I think the punitive action that we have against people who are taking or using drugs, or possessing, or in possession of drugs, the punitive and criminalized behavior that we have towards those people also stops and prohibits people from saying things about their sexual encounters within that environment, and also domestic violence as well. But that's another topic. But but I wanted to ask you, what would you say to somebody who was fearful of contacting perhaps the police about sexual assault in that context?
Everything you said there was just so interesting, and I'm 100% going to answer your main question, but I just wanted to comment on something you said near the beginning of, like, when you have sex, whatever, you're not thinking about whether it's consensual or not, and then maybe some time passes, whether that's months or years or decades, and you look back and you think, actually, maybe I wasn't consenting there, or and how does that make you feel, and like what does that mean? Like, are you now like a victim of sexual assault? Like, do you have, like, is that, because that feels like kind of a big thing to say, or like, are you not, like, how, do you know what I mean? So I think one thing that's really like come up through doing this research, and again, this is mostly with women, though I have spoken to some men and like non-binary people as well about like challenging experiences, but I have to say it's like mostly women who are saying this, cis women, doing that very thing, saying, this was one of my first sexual experiences. At the time I didn't think anything of it. Now I think it probably was sexual assault, and like whatever. But it's like, what I found interesting was people who had reframed it then, and then reframed it again, then reframed it as something else. And it was like, because in lots of these situations, like you say, it feels too late to say, it feels like there's no point, I don't know, like, I don't want to get the person in trouble, and blah blah, and they're all legit, like, fair enough, so it's more about then, how you define your experience, how does it make you feel, and is it serving you? I think that's kind of what the people talk about. Like, I'm thinking about one participant in particular. She said, for a while I did see myself as a victim, and I was really angry, and like it was horrible, and like now I've kind of reframed it again, and I like kind of enjoy taking at least part ownership of what happened to me, because it just makes me feel good, it makes me feel better, and I don't hold myself responsible or to blame, but I can see my role in what happened to me, and that's useful to me. So I think, yeah, it's seeing, I guess, like, it's interesting to have that reflection on how you define it, how it makes you feel, and is it serving you in a positive way. But then the second bit of what you said, you know, how would you advise someone to like go to the police about something like that? I mean, I've got to be honest, I don't know if I said this last time, I'd have a hard time like advising someone to go to the police about a sexual assault, because I just think like the chances of anything happening are low. Like we know it's really low for like people to actually get convicted of anything. Like I just and we also know from like, you know, people who've been through it, that it can be a really horrible experience, and that you're, you know, being questioned, and sometimes people call it like a second rape, like from the criminal justice system. And it's just like, it's hard to say you should go do that, but I'm sure that will make you feel good. So there's so like it's complex, isn't it? And I don't know, like I think, I mean, I probably, if you asked this question last year, I probably said this in response, so I'm sorry if I'm saying the same thing again, but I had a kind of bad sexual experience that I felt was like maybe consensual, like maybe not, and I didn't say anything at the time. Very similar to the story, to be honest. I texted the guy after, like I sent him a really long like text where I said, I could kind of put a disclaimer at the top, not accusing you of rape, like, by the way, all good. Like, just wanted to tell you like how this was from my perspective. Like, I didn't want to have sex. I found it quite like unpleasant, and I have been feeling kind of bad afterwards. Like, felt like I couldn't tell you at the time. But now I can tell you. And so there was kind of some kind of, it was a little bit cathartic, you know. So there were other things I guess you can do, like to get someone to take accountability, that doesn't necessarily involve like going to the police, especially when it's a grey area, you know, where someone might think you consented and someone didn't. But you know, obviously if someone does want to go to the police and thinks it's worth it, and you know, it's well, like I fully respect that as well, and think that's great too. So you know, it's such a personal thing, isn't it? I don't know if that was a answer. I hope it was.
Yeah, no, I think it's useful. I don't know whether you can answer that question solidly and concretely, but I think it's good to have a talk about it as well. I have another question, and then I'll go on to the next ones. What did I said in the chat? I've worded this like a fool, but I'll reword it in person and say, so what do you think about, or have you even thought about Tantra and westernized Tantra, and the things and problems that are arising through that? I know it's not necessarily drug related, but in terms of consent.
I feel like maybe you all know something about westernized Tantra that I don't. That would help me to answer this question. Is there some, like, I feel like maybe is there some, I feel like I just don't really know anything about Tantra, but I would like to.
No, I'll skip it. We'll go for another day. Maybe we'll have a live about it and talk about it on another occasion, because it's not specifically to do with drugs, so I'll skip that. Cool. So what do you believe is the main reason that drives men to use date rape drugs or spiking? And to reduce the numbers of men, would early intervention be an effective means? Also, do you have any advice about opening a dialogue with a friend or family member who spikes people, or that you know who's spiked people?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Thank you. All these questions are so interesting. Thank you for all of them. Yeah, so
just a reminder, if you've asked that question and you want to have like a dialogue like I'm doing with Alex, then you can go for it. Turn on your camera. It's up to you.
Cool. Yeah, so again, like I feel like I'm maybe a bit of a disappointment on this question, but I do have lots of thoughts in response. So what do I think is the main reason that drives men to use date rape drugs or spiking? I have to say I don't know if I know drink spiking is something that's really seen, you know, to be something that happens, like it's really a risk. And I think most people know someone who's like, you know, I was spiked, or I think I was spiked. Hard to know for sure, but like I was way more drunk than I thought I would be, and I think I was spiked. Like I think one of my exes thought they'd been spiked at something. and I didn't think they had, to be honest, but you know, they thought they had. But like I've read some stuff on drink spiking that kind of says like perceived risk versus actually it happening is there's a huge mismatch. And then again, it also is like, what are you counting as drink spiking? Does it have to be, you know, putting some kind of substance that isn't alcohol into a drink, or is someone giving someone like, you know, a double rather than a single? Does that count as drink spiking? You know, if they think they're drinking a single but actually they're drinking a double. And I think probably yes, like that would fall under drink spiking. But I wonder if, you know, people in the wider population would necessarily think of, when they think of drink spiking, would think, oh, maybe that as well. But I do actually have a male participant who in my study who is in his 40s, I think, and he is into what he calls chemical dominance. So that means he is like, you know, he calls it a kink of his, like it's a turn on for him to drug his wife, basically, and they kind of have an agreement where they where like he told her, you know, this is something I'm into, I want to do it, and she's kind of like, okay, well, you can do it when you want, and I'm gonna like trust you to make decisions about when it's appropriate. Like I trust that you wouldn't spike me the night before I have like a big business meeting or something, you know what I mean? Like they have that kind of understanding. So then, you know, sometimes when they're drinking, he'll put like a bit of GHB in her drink without her knowing. And I asked him, like, you know, what is it that you like about it? You know, tell me more, please, about chemical dominance. And he said, like, I like her body being in this kind of passive state where she's kind of, you know, a bit out of it, like kind of, you know, like the kinds of things I was talking about at the beginning of the presentation, like maybe semi-conscious, very passive, blah blah blah. So I wonder if there's something to be said, and this is very speculative, like in response to this question. What do you think is the reason? Like for this guy, I guess you could say, if you're looking at it in that way, the reason is because he wants to have sex with a woman's body that like is a certain way. Like he that's a turn on to him, and there's something about power. Like surely there's something about power there. If anything, it's about power. So yeah, that's kind of a relevant example from my PhD research. But then advice about opening a dialogue with a friend or family member who spikes people, God, that's a tough one, isn't it? I mean, like when opening a dialogue with anyone about anything, I guess you could think about, you know, you never want to go in with anything that's going to put them on the defensive, because you don't want them to like respond by being like, no, I don't do that. So don't go in with like an accusatory tone, and kind of try and gain as much understanding as possible about where they're coming from and what their motivations are and what they're doing. It's so you can kind of start the topic in a way that doesn't come across as an attack. But yeah, God, I've got to say, like, I think that's a really, I don't know, I feel like someone more qualified. I feel like there should be someone more qualified on giving advice than me, but that's kind of what I can say. But I think it's such an interesting question. I hope something I said was helpful, and thank you for asking it.
So kind of continuing on that, somebody asked, but is comparing the perceived risk versus actual risk a fair comparison for drink spiking? I know a lot of people who have been spiked and never reported it. So surely they would counted into the actual risk category either, though it is occurring. So, you know, it's what's recorded and what's not.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And like, of course, like the amount of reportings of drink spiking is likely to be like so low particularly when we think like the reportings of sexual assault is so low. So yeah, definitely. There's a paper I'm thinking of about this. I don't remember it off the top of my head. That talked about this, perceived risk versus actual risk. And given what I know about the person who wrote it, I'm sure they would have taken this into consideration in like making their arguments. I feel confident that they would have done that, but and still made the argument. But I read this paper in fact, I read this paper when I was writing my PhD proposal, so it's quite a long time ago now. But maybe I can find it and email it later or something, because it's a really interesting read. But yeah, that's a great point.
Cool, thank you so much. If anybody else has any other questions, pop them in the chat now. If you don't, we'll come to the end. One last question. Dex, do you have a last question? Can't hear you, man.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I just wanted to bring up that I really enjoyed speaking to you on our Instagram live last week. And I was wondering if you could just give a little more information about how you're collecting this data, because I found that quite interesting about like kind of your research methods. Yeah.
So I think I mentioned like very briefly in the thing I'm doing, like getting people to keep diaries about their experiences. So I literally like give people like a small book, like workbook like you'd get in school, and they write in there. And then some people who like the posting was a bit not feasible, they did theirs in a Word document. So it's kind of a combination of those things. And then like after a period of between 3 to 6 months, I'd get the diary back, I'd read it, and then I'd kind of design an interview with them based on what they'd written. Yeah, and it was great. Like people, honestly, they wrote such like I can't believe I only had to pick one story, because I must have like, I don't know, like 50 or 60 different experiences that have been written about, and they're all just like fascinating in their own way, and they're all so good. And it was surprising like how detailed people wrote, and how how much information they gave about what are very, very personal experiences, and a lot of like difficult experiences as well. But yeah, and I also did like a bit of an ethnographic component as well, where I kind of was going to online Zoom sex parties, and kind of where people were taking drugs as well, and like observing what was going on there. Definitely it was harder to when you're watching people have sex, it's hard to get a kind of, you get an insight, but it's obviously from you. And I feel very much like I'm like, well, I wouldn't like it if that was happening to me, but maybe they do, I don't know. So who's to say? So it was quite difficult, but it was fun, it was good, it was interesting. But yeah, obviously getting those stories from people's perspectives like just felt so like rich and like dripping in detail. It's great. But yeah.
Were the people that gave you the stories like British, or were they all British?
They weren't. They were like some were probably like just under half were, and then there were some people in Europe, some people in the US and Canada, Colombia.
I just find that a talk like this really kind of opens me personally up to like talking about sex in a more ease, with more ease, and yeah, because it's just being British is quite difficult, isn't it? For us to talk about. Anyway,
I said this on the Instagram. I said this on the Instagram live, but I think I'm like the most awkward sex researcher in the world. Like I'm always like, say someone's talking about a blowjob or something, and I'm like, can you tell me more about blowjob? I said to Dex as well. I think I said to like a 40-year-old guy, like, were you doing ham stuff or mouth stuff? And I was like, oh no, it's so embarrassing. But yeah, so I find it embarrassing to talk about sex, even though I'm always doing it.
Great. Well, thank you so much for this. It's been a great talk, and thank you so much to everybody who's joined us for our first talk opening our conference.